The foundation of our work has to do with discovering the nature within us. So we relate to that as the inner and outer landscapes, and the nature within us is reflected by the nature outside of us, and those are very ancient foundations for many, if not all, human traditions that are based on interconnectedness, reciprocity, and relations that we have with ourselves and the world around us.
All right. Welcome, everybody, back for another episode of Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. I'm your host, Gabe Crane. I'm joined by my co-host, Rahul Didwania. And we ask if you like what we are making here to please subscribe to our newsletter at wovenwings.net and share this podcast with your communities. Our episode today is titled Essential Humanity, the Shared Human Heart and Planetary Healing. And we're joined by the founder of the Paititi Institute for the Preservation of Ecology and Indigenous Culture, Roman Hannes. That is an organization based in Peru, doing a lot of amazing work that we will hear about today. And, I think all of our episodes kind of have a particular bent and orientation. They're all about bringing us towards a place of wisdom, equipping us with practical tools that we can use to improve our lives. And this episode in particular is really about expanding our minds, trying to take a step back and look at the big picture and see things in a way that we haven't necessarily seen them before. Roman's vision and the work they're doing at Paititi is a very expansive vision. It's rooted in traditions from South America and also other traditions from around the world. And it's really oriented around this notion of awakening to our own essential humanity, our own heart, in the service of planetary healing. This is a bold, committed version of a worldview that we are excited to share with you today, and get into kind of some of the ins and outs of that. And so before I get any further, I just want to bring you in, Rahul, my co-host, and just kind of see how you're feeling as we get ready to bring Roman on today and discuss these big topics of essential humanity and planetary healing.
Thank you, Gabe. I think you said it really well. Like, this is an episode that I view as really falling into that wisdom bucket, as far as what we really try to focus on. And I think over several episodes now, we've been bringing in new ideas, but also talking a little bit about how do we integrate all these different ideas, and how do we account for the fact that we're learning from and pulling knowledge and wisdom from so many different sources. And in this particular instance, I'm looking forward to having a conversation that's really going to broaden my horizons, right? And introduce me to some ideas and concepts that might be familiar. I know you and I, Gabe, talk about some of these kinds of things, but don't, for me at least, feel grounded yet. And I think just having this conversation with Roman and learning a little bit about what his worldview is and what their institute is focused on really offers an opportunity to dig into some areas that are maybe different, from what we encounter day to day. And very much looking forward to that.
I had the pleasure of meeting Roman and working with him when I was actually spending a good amount of time in South America. This is now coming up on a decade ago, which is kind of crazy. Roman and the work they're doing at Paititi with his wife, Cynthia, as well. Unique model of drawing on different traditions and also working with indigenous populations and ecologically oriented groups within the service of this broader sense of holistic healing. And I think we've touched on that in some different episodes, but I'm excited to kind of have the presence of that indigenous wisdom with us today through Roman. And so on that note, I do want to invite Roman Hannes into the studio here to join us today. Roman has been working closely with the indigenous Peruvian cultures in the Amazonian rainforest and Andean mountains since 2001. And during this time, he has devoted his life to learning the ancient healing ways of these cultures while seeking possibilities for creating ecological sources of sustenance for local populations and working to preserve the rainforest and its spiritual heritage that includes a skillful application of sacred medicinal plants. I would say that Roman is an expert maybe for folks coming from the outside in what we'd broadly call shamanism. I'm curious to ask Roman about that, if he would identify with that. And as we've noted, Paititi really focuses on this notion of the shared human heart and accessing it to contribute to planetary healing. Roman has a fascinating personal story growing up around the world and ending up in Peru. So without further ado, I'm excited to hear more about that today. Roman, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Gabe and Rahul. Wonderful to be here with you today. And I'm looking forward to our conversation and continue deepening the subject.
I think as just a starting point, and I know, Roman, you've been speaking about this and working on this for, I guess, a couple decades at this point. But can you take us through a bird's eye view of some of the worldview that you operate with and that Paititi has? These notions we've laid out of planetary healing, the shared human heart, essential humanity. What are these terms? And could you just take us through our worldview, so your worldview, so we have a general orientation to our conversation today?
The foundation of our work has to do with discovering the nature within us. So we relate to that as the inner and outer landscapes, and the nature within us is reflected by the nature outside of us, and those are very ancient foundations for many, if not all, human traditions that are based on interconnectedness, reciprocity, and relations that we have with ourselves and the world around us. And then through the resolution of the inner conflicts and inner diseases, coming to peace with oneself, then naturally an inspiration arises to be of benefit to the greater whole outside of us as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Roman. And just to continue digging in on some of these terms. So when we use the term shared human heart, what exactly does that mean? And my immediate question is like, is there a shared human heart? What is that? And if so, how do we access it? And what does that look and feel like?
Thank you, Rahul. Yeah, that is a really good question. And to relate to this question in a basic way, maybe I can start by bringing an example how it's been found through some modern scientific studies where children in newborn hospital departments they have observed this very fascinating phenomena that when one child starts farting, then all the other children they synchronize and they start farting at the same time. So for the sake of the conversation, we can relate to it as the shared human fart. Right? It comes quite naturally, and this is something that we do from the moment that we are born. And so then, if it's possible for us to naturally share a human fart when we are born, then as we are developing and becoming more conscious and more evolved, then it's possible for us to also share the human heart. So that's in the most basic way. And then, of course, we can start seeing how the things that we do to ourselves and to our world then impacts everyone else as well. We are sharing the ecosystem, we are sharing this planet. The choices that we make on a personal level then are affecting the collective in one way or another, where it's through our physical actions or through certain ignorance that we perpetuate in ourselves. And so then seeing how we are unconsciously already interconnected, and then in a way we are co-creating this collective dream, and each of us is doing our part of it. So then the more that we can do that in an awakened way, the more we can co-create this collective dream consciously, the more that we can benefit the greater whole and ourselves included in that.
Thanks for that, Roman. I heard a couple elements that you were expressing there. One seemed to be related with this idea even of like mirror neurons and being able to reflect back to one another based on how we're behaving and then having that be mirrored to us neurologically. Then I think there's this other idea you're talking about of having a shared dream that we're a part of, and a shared kind of something that's more, I want to say, it's like there's a there. Like when I think of there's a shared human heart, or you also use this term essential humanity, it's like I'm tapping into something that is fundamental, that if I access that, if I go deep down enough, I'll find something that's the same that you have. And I'm curious if you can just talk to us a little bit more about that. What do you find there that is in common, that you and I have in common, or that you, me, and Rahul here, or folks listening, are tapping into that same space? How do we access that, and how do we know that we are accessing it when we get there?
Thank you, Gabe. Well, that's definitely something that I encourage people to check with themselves. Is this a shared fart moment that we're having, or this is a shared heart moment that we're having? Is this coming from an unconscious impulse or a reaction, or this is coming from a more intentional presence that we are cultivating together? And then it's possible to check oneself, and then we can also relate with each other. What you're mentioning about the mirroring neurons is a very fascinating subject, and definitely it is connected. It has been found, for example, again in child psychology, that when children make eye contact, at first with their immediate parents and then with the world at large, there is actually a lot of synchronization on a neurological level that is happening in that moment. And then there are also studies nowadays that confirm the wisdom of the ancestors that spoke about the interconnectedness. When we harm others, we harm ourselves. And this is something that the human brain actually cannot differentiate. When I am having negative thoughts about others, the brain doesn't differentiate that in terms of others or oneself. And then, of course, we can see the ancestral wisdom from different traditions that speak about that, how wishing harm to others is like drinking poison and expecting others to die from it. This is having a direct impact, the disturbing emotions and feelings that are being perpetuated in one's life. And then, first and foremost, it is hurting oneself. So, this principle comes from very ancient times and is beginning to be confirmed.
I'm still thinking about this distinction between, the shared fart and the shared heart. So I think with the shared fart, right, and kind of building on some of the things that were said, it's like if we observe something, whether consciously and we see it, we hear it, and we're aware that we're doing that, or maybe it's happening around us. There's an environmental influence that we are picking up through our senses in some form. And then, then neurologically, there's the mirror neurons effect where we start seeing it and internalizing it at the neurological level and maybe playing it out that way. That part of it, I can kind of understand, whether through a scientific lens or even just generally. I'm like, yeah, you see something, you start to internalize it and maybe you start acting in that way. This shared heart piece, sounds like it runs deeper than that, right? And I think you mentioned we encourage people to observe and to notice, like, hey, what is this? Is it shared heart, where there's maybe some connection that isn't at the driven only by senses, or is it shared fart, where it's like, hey, we see something, we emulate that behavior? And I think I'm still trying to understand exactly what that looks like. If I start observing it and I maybe make this assessment that, hey, I think this is shared heart, where is that coming from? And I think one way I think about it is, if we start with the belief that we're all connected and that we all have, whether it's collective consciousness, whether it's a common soul, we are all an extension of the divine, all different ways of talking about our deep underlying connection. If we start with that belief, then I can start to tell myself certain things, right? Like, oh, this is coming from that place, and believe it. And so maybe that's one way of believing that, hey, I'm in this moment, I'm accessing that, essential humanity, that shared heart, that collective consciousness. But I'm curious if there are other ways to like know, to have that inner knowing that, yes, this is coming from that place and not just some story that I'm telling myself. Does that make sense, Roman? I'm happy to clarify. I know that was a lot of different points there.
Well, I find that I call it too simple for the complicated mind to understand. And essentially, it has to do with some of the most basic functions that allow us to exist as organic beings. So we have this ecosystem that we are all connected through. And even when astronauts go into space, they have to take a miniature version of the ecosystem with them in order to survive. So there has to be some oxygen to breathe and some basic nutrients that are necessary for life. And so we can see it happening from the most gross levels of our existence and then all the way into the most subtle ones. And on the more subtle ones, it may come through as an unconscious reaction. And then, of course, hating the haters will never resolve hatred. And so then it becomes just knee jerk reaction that happens on an impulsive and instinctual level. So that is a shared part. So we can reflect and we can see how different experiences are happening, the choices that each one of us is making in our lives in each moment. Is it coming from fear or is it coming from love? Is it coming from scarcity or is it coming from inspiration? And so this is something that everyone can check in with themselves.
It's funny. This trope that we've developed here of like the shared fart and the shared heart is it's funny because you mentioned there's scarcity, and I guess it's opposite. I've heard that described as abundance or flow or whatever we want to call that. But it seems like part of what we're talking about, and you keep referring back to, Roman, is this ecologically oriented or field oriented, a system oriented way of thinking about ourselves and thinking about ourselves not just as individuals, but as kind of these nodes of consciousness or, that are embedded within these systems. And we're talking a lot on this overall season of our show around this idea of a shift in consciousness and the developments that are taking place in consciousness today and the importance of spirituality and awareness practices, consciousness practices to be able to work with that in a positive way. And so I'm curious if there's an element to what you're talking about here that has to do with help us connect it to this emergence of a global consciousness or of a consciousness that's bigger than us as individuals. And you mentioned, it's too complicated or it's too simple for the complicated mind to figure out. I think at least my own experience of that is a lot of my complications come mentally when I'm isolated, when I'm really trying to think about this in terms of myself or how I hack myself into this other thing that I'm not connected to right now. And yet what I hear you describing is this other thing that's simple, that's intrinsic, it's already there, that we are connected to and that we are a part of. And so can you help us understand that? Am I on the right track? Is that similar to what you're describing?
I can definitely relate to what you're sharing, and in terms of what is happening right now, how there is a certain collective process that everyone are experiencing in their own individual ways. And it is starting to become more tangible, as I shared, where we are starting to experience the impact of a certain lifestyle that has been perpetuated on the planet today that is simply not sustainable and is based on consumerism rather than mutual support and care. And then, of course, through that comes a sense of separation and isolation that many are experiencing in the world today, where it can happen in so many different ways. So it has happened through COVID, for example, and it has been found that even this emergence of different pandemics in the world right now, it is also a side effect of an imbalanced ecosystem. And then it happens on many other levels because of the scarcity of resources, and there are nations that are impoverished, and all kinds of different wars that are happening in the world due to resources that are being in competition at this time in the world, and also depletion of certain fossil remains on the planet. And so then we can see how this life is not sustainable, and it is based on consumption and avoidance of the main issues that we are facing as a humanity living on this planet. And then, of course, that can then also go into the spiritual crisis that many people experience, the dilution of deeper human values that existed in more ancient times, and then a culture that is based on entertainment and instant gratifications that don't have lasting benefit in people's lives. And then that creates more and more of a scarcity mentality, and people want to run away into all kinds of fantasies even more rather than deal with reality. So this thing with the mind, that is very complicated. It's not the mind itself that is bad in a way, but it's just the mind that has been conditioned to hide from the heart and then use all the creative energy that is available in one's life to avoid facing this deep wounds of humanity, the vulnerability, the tenderness, the aspects of humanity that in a way have not found a place in the modern world today, this competitive corporate kind of world that doesn't really have a place for innocence, for the heart-centered presence. And this is starting to also create more and more of a neurosis in human society, just from what I observe, and also the different psychological reviews and studies that are being taken at this time. And so this brings us to a certain spiritual emergency that is happening in the world alongside with the eco emergency.
As it relates to this idea of a spiritual emergency, right? I think I'm wondering if the response to that is what, this concept of healing or planetary healing that we've been alluding to. And I'd love to understand, what exactly does healing look like? And is healing the response to this spiritual crisis? And if so, like, what is it? How do we engage in it? How do we know that we're on a path towards healing versus something else, something that might be posing as healing but actually isn't?
That is also a really good question, Raul. Thank you. So the healing, it is of course another relative term, and many people may allude to healing in a way that our modern allopathic medicine alludes to it, in terms of just fixing some kind of symptoms, like in a robot, some parts stop working. But in the perspective of many ancient holistic traditions, the healing is not about fixing something, but it's more about realizing. It's more about coming to certain maturation and coming to certain inner state of resolution that allows one to, in a way, outgrow a certain illness, if we see illness as a wake up call. So, in a way, it's a response, a meaningful response to a wake up call. And many ancient traditions, they revolve around healing because they are geared towards facing the issues rather than avoiding them. And so in Amazon, in the Andes, there are those principles of the healing circle, of the reciprocity. And then we can see that in many cultures, and Northern Native American tradition, It's the all my relations. In the Mayan culture is in Lakesha Lakin. In the Hawaiian culture also aloha, we share the breath of life together. And so we can see this principle of the shared healing, of the interconnectedness. And also this principle of by healing oneself, then the world outside is also supported and healing. And the healing in a way relates to this principle of facing the suffering of life. And so in our modern society, again, these ancient traditions, they are struggling today because, and I have friends in the Kero nation here in the Andes and also in the Amazonian tribes that are struggling to maintain their heritage in the face of today's world, where the world today is not so interested in the capacity of this human spirit to shine in the face of adversity. The modern world is more geared towards covering things up and taking a pill, a magical pill that will resolve the pain, at least temporarily, or an entertainment industry that will make me just find some kind of oblivion and not deal with the issues. And then, of course, these ancestral traditions, they just turn into a tourist sideshow attraction that is done just for the sake of entertainment, which is what people are used to, rather than actually encouraging people to trust in their own capacity to face all the challenges, all the adversity in life.
Well, let me see if I could summarize at least what I'm hearing. I've got a two-part question for you here, Roman. The first being just to summarize and see if I'm tracking you correctly, and then I'll get to the question. So, if I'm understanding it correctly, it sounds to me like you're saying that, in our modern world, our minds get complicated, and we also tend to then isolate ourselves and create a sense of separation between ourselves and the world because of this complicated mind, and that causes suffering. And in our modern context, we also are primed and conditioned to avoid dealing with the suffering. So then as we get isolated, we go further and further away rather than turning around to face the music, so to speak, or face the disconnect that we're experiencing and the pain that that causes. We just cover that up with entertainment. And then even if we get interested maybe in healing a little bit, it can also get routed into this, into something that's kind of a tourist attraction, as you said, or entertainment. It's not truly deep and authentic. And it sounds like the antidote to that, to becoming refused, right, become reintegrated into our environment and something bigger than ourselves, is to turn around and be present to, I guess, the full spectrum of human experience, not just the nice things, but the difficult things and the pain of that separation, which would lead us to reconnect and kind of become re-embedded into the world around us, not just socially. It sounds like, I'm hearing you talk about connections with human beings, but I'm also hearing you talk about this kind of deeper connection with our environment or with nature, the bigger world around us, and that's kind of the pathway to this healing that you're talking about. Am I tracking you correctly? Would you clarify or add anything into that?
Thank you, Gabe. Yeah, I appreciate your feedback on that. Yeah, I relate to it as the party training of the monkey mind, especially having two kids, and I think you can relate. So, so it's the party training of the monkey mind. And yeah, the mind in itself, again, it's just the mind that is not trained to honor the heart, right? So there is the retraining that takes place in these ancient traditions. It's how to make this capricious monkey mind, this capricious master, into a humble servant of the greater organism. And then, of course, it's this entire system that we are living in today that is basically geared towards attention deficit disorder. and very little attention span, and the mind that is operating 1,000 miles an hour, and just thinking about all of those things, and then there is not enough presence that is available in our lives just to be human, to relate in the nature. Of course, the nature outside reflects the nature inside, but it's the nature inside that is the source of who we are. And then we can be reminded by the nature outside, but it's really coming to terms with ourselves, not just always having the TV on just because there is a fear of being with oneself and all the unresolved issues that are boiling in there. So then, of course, there is again something that I see is this elaborate self-deception manufactured for collective consumption in our today's society, and the living wisdom traditions, which I have been dedicated with to for the last 2 decades, and I continue to because I'm grateful to these traditions. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be alive today. And so there is this turnaround process that takes place, this deconditioning, or you can refer to it as the unlearning, coming back to oneself, to just being, not trying to be something or someone, trying to get somewhere or accomplish something, but to just be. And this is something that the ancient traditions, the living wisdom traditions, are pointing to on the level of being.
Thanks for that, Roman. I guess my follow up question to that would be if you could maybe contextualize that for us in some of your own experience. You know, we alluded to this at the top of the show. You've got a very interesting personal story. You've grown up between multiple countries in the former Soviet Union, the United States, Israel, and then you ended up doing, you know, your entire professional and adult life now in Peru in South America. I'm curious. I mean, obviously, this is a huge, you know, your life is a huge journey, but I'm curious if you might be able to give us some examples from your own personal story and journey to from where you started to where you are now about how this whole healing process has looked for you and where it's kind of led you to today.
Relate to it in short, where it started off for me just from a sense of not belonging from since I was a child, and then experiencing persecution and racism, in a way becoming a refugee. First, my family have become refugees in the Soviet Union. I was born in Moldova, and I was born 50 kilometers away from the capital of Ukraine, and there's war. A lot of conflict is happening right now in that region. My family have become refugees, first in that sense of just fleeing a hostile environment and persecution, and then that continued on more subtler levels where I could never really find a certain sense of belonging, in terms of belonging to a certain ethnicity or a race or a certain spiritual movement or affiliation, or I could never really find a sense of belonging within any of that, and that really helped me in my spiritual path. So at first it just started to happen in life in general, and I was a refugee coming from the ex-Soviet Union, and my family first came to Israel, and then coming to Israel, and where in the Soviet Union I was being ridiculed and told to go back to Israel, and then coming to Israel I was an immigrant to Israelis, and then I was hearing the same thing about going back to the Soviet Union, because there are a huge wave, right, that came from the ex-Soviet Union. Then that continued where it was really hard to connect to a dogmatic spiritual system. It was not possible for me. And so when I came to the Amazon rainforest 20 years ago and connected to the indigenous elders, for the first time it made sense to me, because the indigenous tribes in the Amazon, their names in their language, they actually don't have a sense of separation, but they basically mean human beings. And that's what my teachers taught me first and foremost, is to learn how to be in a how to be a human being in a human body. So just having a human body, my elders taught me, does not make me into a human being. Brings us to the topic of essential humanity, where in the Amazon rainforest, essential humanity relates to those qualities that allow for the empowerment of the human collective. So the human culture, and especially in the Amazon rainforest, you can maybe see it more clearly, where there's a very harsh environment, and it's not really that it's the survival of the fittest, but it's the thriving of a community that makes a difference. And the essential human qualities, they are the qualities that are inherent qualities we are born through. We experience a sense of interconnectedness in the mother's womb. We are connected through the umbilical cord. We are connected through our consciousness, where the consciousness of the mother and the consciousness of the child are inseparable from each other. And then the child, nobody has to teach a child what love means, what mother means, what nurturing means, what friendship means. That's something that we are born with. And then we'll start to learn all the other shadow aspects of this existence when we come out of this deep sense of interconnectedness in the womb, and we see this illusory reality of separation. So then, by remembering the essential human qualities, it's possible to rise above the difficulties and unite together. And again, if we can relate to the Buddhist psychology, there was a great master, Thich Nhat Hanh, and when somebody asked him if he would rather live in a world where there is no suffering, he said no, because then without suffering there wouldn't be kinship, there wouldn't be compassion, kindness, relatedness, openness, learning from each other. So the difficulties, they are also essential to the degree that we can relate to each other, we can learn, we can discover and come out of certain vicious cycles.
Related to that, Roman, I think first off, I'm just internalizing your path and all of the different things that you went through. And one of the themes that sort of popped out for me is you were aware to some degree as it was happening, maybe some of it in retrospect, but you were aware of what sounded like a missing sense of belonging, right? Or a missing sense of that interconnectedness or that love or that communal feeling that I think you've alluded to. And your journey took you to a place where that seems to have been more inherent to the culture and to the way that they live and to the way that they even welcomed you in as someone coming from a different place. And there's, beauty to that, I think, in terms of finding a place where you could feel that interconnectedness and that belonging and that love and that energy that was supportive to your own unfolding as a person. And but then the other part of me is like, well, okay, what if, we are in environments that don't naturally cultivate that, right? And I think where you started to just go with what Thich Nhat Hanh has said is like, oh, even that in a way is an opportunity, an opportunity for you to engage with whatever environment and whatever world you're a part of, and to use that as an opportunity to learn, to grow, to practice your own sense of compassion and love in spite of whatever those circumstances might be. But what I'm building towards is I'm curious if you have any point of view or advice for people that are maybe in an environment that doesn't naturally embody some of these principles that you're talking about, where maybe one way of talking about that is that people in an environment that we're in are like disconnected from some of these principles of essential humanity. If you're someone who's trying to then find that essential humanity, get in touch with it, be operating from that place of love rather than fear, abundance rather than scarcity, and so on. how do you do that? How do you actually get there? And what are some of the practices? What are some of the sources of inspiration or education that people can turn to? And I know that answer is vast, but I'm curious what your take is on that.
Thank you, Raul. Yeah, I really appreciate your questions that really bring it down to earth. And that is what I'm also dedicated to in my life, because we can be very abstract, but how to make it relevant to the immediate issues that we are facing today as a collective, no matter where we are in the world. And what I was sharing in terms of being a refugee, and then of course, I came, even before I came to the Amazon, I've started to get involved in Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhist psychology. And there is this principle there of a refugee, where in order to find lasting refuge, right? Because we all take refuges anyway in life. We can take refuge in junk food, we can take refuges in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But then most of those refuges, they're not lasting. And then there's even more anxiety and misery, because then nothing lasts, and then just needing to jump like a frog from one sinking island to another, and that's very exhausting. So then, to find something that I can fully relax in, and where I can find myself being nurtured, like you mentioned, where I can find that love. And then, of course, needing to look for that in all the wrong places, at least in my life, that was an essential ingredient in the recipe of transformation. So there has to be, some kind of a recipe for disaster that takes place first. And needing to lose oneself needing to lose one's way in life in order to find oneself. To become a refugee means to find refuge in the heart. And different ancient cultures that I'm connected to, they are pointing to a certain state of being that is beyond concepts, and they relate to truth not as a philosophical concepts, but as a state of being, as a state of openness, vulnerability, innocence, receptivity. And within that state, there are unconditional qualities that can overcome the disturbances in one's life. So then the conditioning and this very tricky mind that we've been relating to, essentially, it's this mind that is not trusting in the capacity of the heart to stay open with all the good, bad, and ugly that is happening in life. And so then we are all born with that truth, and then are made to doubt that inherent truth. So within these traditions, it's not like you're being given some kind of a truth from the outside, but then you're being encouraged within your own capacity to stay open to everything in your life. And then the happiness that arises out of that, it's a happiness that is timeless. It's not a happiness that is bound by pleasure alternating with pain, but it's a happiness that is bound by the unconditional nature of the heart, that can tap into greater love than the disturbances and the fears and all of the different limiting states that we can experience. And then in that way, also the sense of separation then becomes a connecting link. Hey, I'm separated, and when I can admit that, and then I can see that you can admit that, and hey, you're separated, I'm separated, suddenly we can relate. And suddenly what was separating us before becomes a connecting link. And then we can tap into a greater motivation to come out of that sense of separation and seclusion. So in that way, I keep bringing it back to the inner nature. It's not, yeah, some people live in a cement jungles where there may not be even outer nature, but yet we still have our inner nature. We have the ebbs and flows of our experiences. We have our dreams. We have the different emotions and feelings that are also going through us, and we are learning how to ride those waves. And so then the more that we can connect to our own inner experience, then the more we can tap into the experience of inner nature. And that is an experience that is not bound by outer circumstances. And with my indigenous teacher, it was the same. It wasn't like they accepted and then they started doing everything for me. No, they accepted me in a way where they told me that I have to face my own issues and nobody will do it for me. And they all have to do it each for themselves. And that is what a community means for them. I do my own work, and in that way I can support you. You do your own work, and in that way you can support me. And so in that way, we can all face each our own issues and then find greater resilience through that. No, I was pretty much done. This is something that we can all relate to and apply within our own circumstances.
I love this idea of the being a refugee and then taking refuge in the heart. And I think it's something that a lot of folks out there today can relate to. You know, at the end of last season, we had Molly Worthen, University of North Carolina professor, New York Times writer, on our show. She talked about the decline of traditional religious institutions. And Rahul, you and I were just discussing, in preparation for some of our work, this, the rising demographic of folks who are spiritual but not religious. I think we live in a world where a lot of the traditional places that we've found refuge, as you described it, aren't available. And so we are trying to figure out how to make our way. And I think your story, Roman, is so fascinating because you draw on these different traditions. You've been connected with teachers from the Amazon. You mentioned Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy. And those have all, and I know others have also been influential for you in shaping your worldview. And I'm curious if you have any advice for people. Okay, when we're looking for that refuge, you mentioned a couple things. You mentioned a place where you could fully relax, or you mentioned your teachers in the Amazon teaching you about being a human being in a human body, and something clicking for you amidst your search when you found them. And I'm curious if you could zero in on that and help us and help people listening understand this a little more. What are some of the qualities of refuge? What are some of the indicators that would suggest when we're going along, okay, like that's a good direction to go, or here's someone or a system or a teaching that I can connect to that will genuinely help me, because I can notice kind of some of these effects that it's having within my mind and body. And I'm curious if you could just help us understand that a little bit more to give people more guidance.
Thank you, Gabe. Yeah, I also came from this kind of generation where I don't need any teachers and I can do it myself and I can kind of connect to the different spiritual traditions and just take what is useful. But then I was lucky enough to discover early enough how essential the lineage holders are in these traditions, because without that, even though I was going in the right general direction, I was reinventing the wheel that would have taken me many lifetimes to reinvent. And then to actually tap in into accumulated experience of many generations of people who were checking through their own experience. And this is what I find meaningful in these traditions, is that it's not just dogmatic knowledge that has to be blindly followed, but it is encouraged of everyone who are coming in contact with these traditions to actually check through their own experience. Don't just believe what I say. Try it out. See how that works. Do some homework. See what is meaningful. And then through your experience, it's possible then to develop your own foundation that allows you to relate to the lineage, to the tradition, to the experience of other people. And so within that also, there are so many pitfalls within the spiritual paths. And I've seen it so often how it seems like there is a total breakdown. And in that moment, when the person wants to just turn around and run and bolt, then actually they're one step away from a breakthrough. And without the guidance of the lineage, it's so easy to be fooled and think that it's not working and it's totally failing. And actually, there is this resolution of deep seated obscurations and conditioning and all kinds of identities that may feel like the end of the world in that moment, but it's actually just the beginning. So then, of course, there is a process, and this refugee, in a way, basically what I was pointing to is this process of self-parenting. Yeah, as a child, the infant is born, right? We all go through what in child psychology is referred to as the womb separation syndrome. So there is this place where we are fully relaxed, we're fully safe and at ease. Everything is provided. All the wishes are fulfilled, even without the need to say anything. In the mother's womb, there's such a deep intuitive nurture that is happening. And then it's happening in the dark. I don't have to be aware of that. I'm a consumer of love, of unconditional love. And then I'm born out into this world of seeming appearances, and then gradually I'm separated more and more from that place where everything is automatically provided. And now I have to scream for attention. And the mother is not available all the time, and maybe she comes and breastfeeds and holds the child when the child is screaming, but then it's available less and less. And then there is the what do you call it? The weaning of the breast milk, and then just holding and embracing and guiding with words. And so gradually, then coming to a point where that love that I've been seeking on the outside of me, that has been provided to me by nature as a point of reference, I have to learn how to generate it myself. I have to tap in into that capacity that the nature within is capable of. And it's all part of the wisdom, this evolutionary wisdom of nature that we can go through more and more consciously. And so then with this refugee process is that basically in order for me to become a refugee, I have to stop seeking refuge in all the places that never brought me a lasting satisfaction before. And then I'm basically not seeking. And then to find refuge in the heart, that basically means that I'm not hiding behind anything. And I'm not using anything to avoid and run away from. And I'm just fully there with everything that is happening in my life. And it's very hard, right? It's easier said than done. And so then the community, right? The intentional community of people who are dedicated towards that is very supportive. And in my life, I found it to be very instrumental. And even through the challenges within the community. And I'm very grateful to Gabe for sharing that space of transformation. And even though it was very challenging when we were in that space together with Gabe, it has provided exponential evolution and transformation and continuous lessons that I keep coming back to years later. Yeah, in a sense, that brings oneself to deconditioning, right? Okay, I'm no longer gonna try to hide in junk food or just binge watching TV or just having some kind of instinctual relationships, but I'm gonna breathe through everything that is happening in my life. I'm gonna learn how to make friends with the shadows, with all of the doubts and fears and inhibitions. And so then no longer to be controlled by them, no longer to be dominated. And so in a way, this refugee is what it takes to take refuge in the heart, not to take refuge in anything else. And the world today provides ample opportunity for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. What's popping up for me here is that I'm feeling almost like a paradox here, where even some of these questions, right, are driven by seeking. There's an element of seeking a course of action, a set of recommendations, or as you even alluded to, it's like taking in inspiration and wisdom and knowledge from different sources and then playing around with it, trying things on, seeing how it feels, building your foundation actively. And I think there is a practice or an element of practicing and working towards becoming that way and tuning into all these things as people. And then I'm noticing also that where the paradox comes in is that seeking is in a way, at least the way I'm viewing it right now, is in a way looking for something outside, right? It's looking for a solution or a manual or a, way to get to this place where we're just okay and comfortable with what is in any given moment. And I think these days, depending on which circles you're moving through, I think this idea of accepting each moment as it is has entered the popular lexicon. I think we hear it a lot more, especially as like Buddhist ideology has really permeated, a lot of self-development and self-help worlds. And I think what I'm sensing there is that concept, it's shrouded in this paradox, right? It's like the simple path to getting there is just to be there. But on the other hand, in order to get there, we need to study, we need to learn, we need to actively get there and decondition, as you said, Roman. And I guess I'm just trying to wrestle with that paradox right now. And I'm curious what that evokes for you, Roman, or what reaction kind of that provokes in you as you just take all that in.
I had to go through that in my life where I had to try to find lasting happiness in all the wrong places. And then at a certain point get sick and tired of being sick and tired. In a way, yeah, it's good to really give it a try. And then also to be honest enough to admit that sometimes people give it a try for so long and they invest so much time in seeking happiness in all the wrong places that then they're embarrassed to admit that. And then they just keep perpetuating the illusion. So then at a certain point, there has to be that recognition, just getting real with oneself and just saying, well, I've been doing it for so long, right? I just keep doing the same thing expecting a different result, and so I think that I'm going to do it harder and it's going to get better, and then it just keeps getting worse and worse. And so at a certain point, enough is enough. And then of course when there is that recognition, because yeah, like you said, Rahul, it's so tempting, right? Just I don't want to face the uncertainty of life. I don't want to just be vulnerable and to deal with impermanence and nothing to rely on. And just give me an instruction manual. Give me some kind of a pill, just tell me what to do. And then, one of my favorite sayings from Castaneda is one time Don Juan said, more than anything, people love to be told what to do. But even more than that, people love not to do what they're told. It is a paradox. We love to be told what to do, but we hate to do what we're told. Once there is that deep reconciliation, and then not doing it because someone says so, or just kind of as a rebel without a cause, but to reconcile with oneself and then to get to know oneself, to take steps into that. And so all of these traditions, they're just pointing to our own inherent organic intelligence, the tapping into that childlike essence that is the beginner's mind, that is fresh. And the beginner's mind, I don't mean like a freshly formatted hard drive, but the beginner's mind is this fresh perspective, the ingenuity, the willingness to improvise, to make mistakes, to learn from the mistakes, not to be afraid to experiment. That is something that is not comfortable, to be in the place of uncertainty, not knowing, and not just following in someone else's footsteps. Within these traditions, yeah, I can be inspired by the teachers, and what my teachers shared with me more than anything is their own spark of dedication. Like, yeah, they face their own particular life circumstances, and my circumstances are different. What worked for them will not work for me. However, that dedication, the qualities that they have cultivated in facing their own issues and finding their own way, out of their predicament is something that I can apply to my own life. So it's the spark, right? That is what is shared in these traditions. If one person can do it, then anyone can do it. And then I can continue to encourage that spark within my own life and not to throw in the towel. So, as an initial step, that is very essential. And then there are specific practices and steps, but it's not generic in the way that people may want it to be, where it's just, yeah, there are levels and I just gonna blindly follow this and then it's gonna happen. No, it is a process of maturation of consciousness and cultivation. The essential human qualities, the patience, learning how to be generous first and foremost with one's own presence, then learning how to have integrity and finding inspiration in the most darkest places, and then having a joyful effort in direction of that, then within that being able to continue to support the heart-centered presence with the essential qualities. And so it may be related in different ways, but it comes back to embodied human qualities. And this is not something that can be substituted with an instruction manual.
I think what you've just shared there, Roman, is so essential for so many of us. And it's also part of what I find particularly unique about you and the journey you've taken. You know, we've talked on this episode today about the different traditions you've learned in from around the world, having traditional teachers, and you've drawn on those instruction manuals, so to speak, but you've always been fiercely connected and committed to your own innate wisdom, your own human organism, and recognizing that that's where it all has to take place, not by following just in someone else's footsteps, even if they can help us, right, move in a direction that we need to go. And so because I want to name that specifically because we've had a number of practitioners of different methodologies on our show, and I think they would resonate and agree with exactly what you're saying. But when we frame it that way, it can sometimes get lost. Like, oh, the focus is on the instruction manual, right? It's on, okay, well, here's one version of an instruction manual that could be helpful to somebody, and so on and so forth. When I think about you in relation to this idea of shamanism, that's part of what I think about is this connection to something that's kind of running throughout all these different traditions, but is also kind of innate or supersedes those traditions, ties into something that's universally human. And I suppose we're actually moving towards needing to wrap up here today. And so what I wanted to ask is, from that space, I think you shared a lot of that with us today, but what would be one key message that you'd like to share with folks today that's really coming from that place of your own personal humanity, maybe as kind of a fruit of, your own journey? But what can we do? What is needed to kind of set out on this path to also maintain that personal connection and authenticity as we go through it, so that it actually yields fruit in our specific personal lives? I'm curious if there's any kind of core idea or key thing that you'd like to share with us and our listeners.
Thank you, Gabe. What we've been discussing today on the collective and individual level, it points a lot to the healing of the wounded innocence and the empowerment of the innocence as the truth within each being. And so then it also touches on the self-parenting process, where it is essential to acknowledge that there is this confused, hurting child within our today's society, and in a way we are also byproducts of that. We are born with that truth, but then everything is making us doubt in that seed of the heart that we all have inside of us. And so the indigenous practices, they do work with our own direct life experience more than some kind of an external tool. And there are tools, but the tools are points into our own innate qualities. And so one of the practices within the indigenous traditions that we work with is the practice of remembrance, where it's essential to first remember a certain anchor state of well-being. So to remember certain experiences in childhood where there has been that connection, that openness, vulnerability, tenderness, nurture, support, embrace, certain experience of just united minds and hearts, a certain kinship with others. And so then to actually practice that state, to keep remembering, first maybe just on the level of the mind, but then to keep embodying the qualities, a certain state that has been experienced already. And within that, the indigenous people say that the peak experiences in our lives, the happiest moments we've had in our lives, they are glimpses into who we truly are. And there are certain experiences in our lives where it's easier to have that glimpse. And then there are other experiences in our lives where the sun is covered up by the clouds, which doesn't mean that the sun is not there. So then to practice the anchor state, right? That's the beginning of the mind training, that party training of the monkey mind. To just anchor oneself in a certain state of openness, of vulnerability, of not needing to prove anything to anyone, and be who you are. And then the self parenting process is to actually take that place from a more safe environment and supportive circumstances, and then to learn how to cultivate and gradually increasing challenges to stay at ease, to stay open, to stay vulnerable. And so then this practice of remembrance, there are particular techniques, and also reflecting on this, we've developed an evolutionary blueprint course online that has this and other practices that is pointing to that. But then there's also the continuous encouragement to make it real, to face one's own life, to see how to apply that in the circumstances of turmoil, to get to know the workings of one's conditioning, right? It's kind of like to see really what makes me tick, and then to know already I'm going into a certain situation, I'm going to get challenged, I'm going to get triggered, so I can use that as a training ground. I can practice the anchor state of well-being, I can keep empowering the innocence. So those practices, they're very down to earth, and it's not something that is very fancy and exotic, which some people, that's what they come for. But this is really to come back to essential humanity within each one of us, and then through that to be able to relate and then to support the world around with one's own awakening greatest potential. And the more that we can humbly share our highest potential with each other, the more our potential will increase and the more the world will benefit.
Roman, thank you so much, for ending on that very practical note. I'm finding myself wanting to explore that, and really start to go down that path right away, and more generally, just want to thank you for your time, for sharing your philosophy, your worldview, and the great work that you're a part of as well, and your story and your journey. So yeah, just very grateful to have had this time with you. And Gabe, I'll turn it over to you to close out. But thank you again, Roman, for your time here.
Yeah, thank you as well. I'm very grateful for all the work that you're doing and how we keep weaving. And yeah, sometimes the life takes us in different directions, and then I'm very inspired to see us coming together and sharing the different perspectives and then finding ways to be of benefit to the world. So I'm very grateful to you and everyone who are tuning in. We'll also share it with our audience, and then yeah, we keep evolving from the shared fart into the shared heart.
Deep and irreverent notes. Yeah, I just want to emphasize what Rahul said, Roman. It's so nice to have you on the show, and really wonderful to reconnect in this way after a lot of time apart. And so this has been a really, really rich hour for folks who are interested in learning more with Roman and being involved with what the Paititi Institute is up to. You can find them online. We will post those links in the show description. You can find that there. It's Paititi, Paititi Institute, paititi-institute.org. You can find out about different retreats in Peru, online Qigong and breathwork activities that you can do with Roman and team. And so on that note, I just want to thank you again for tuning in with us today. It's been a really rich conversation, kind of going into some of these core human patterns that we're wrapped around in, and kind of cutting through a lot of the noise and descriptions and fluff to just be able to come back to those foundational activities that begin that healing process. One thing I'm thinking about as we conclude today is just the way that our own personal healing and the personal journey of waking up, becoming more present, more alive, healthier, more vibrant and human in relationship with our peers and our communities around us. All of that is part of this broader planetary healing. It's part of weaving this broader web of relationships and consciousness that we so sorely need. And so this was a process of that. You listening and engaging with us is part of that. As part of that, please do subscribe and share this episode and our episodes with your community. We feel that these are very important topics for us to be discussing at this point in the world. And we are grateful to have an opportunity to share that with you. So on that note, thank you so much for tuning in with us for another episode, and we will see you next time. Take care and many blessings.